We have the solid minerals sector, which we have left ignored for years because we had the oil and gas. So how do we leverage the minerals that we actually have as well? We have lithium, we have all of these different metals and minerals that can be used for the renewable sector.
Have you ever stopped to consider the role of gas in Africa's energy transition? While renewable energy sources like solar and wind are getting a lot of attention, the sustainable use of gas can act as a bridge fuel in transition towards a greener future, especially in markets like Nigeria that are still relying heavily on fossil fuels. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Policy on the Go, coming to you live from Green Growth TV. I'm Tony Ogubanjo, and today we'll be discussing one of the most pressing topics in the energy sector, the sustainable use of gas. Joining me on the program is Tengi George Ikoli, Senior Officer and Lead of Natural Resource Governance Institute's Nigeria Program. Hello, Tengi, and thank you for joining us today. How are you doing?
Hello, thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
All right. So let's get straight into this conversation. We'll start by discussing the current use of gas utilization in Nigeria. What opportunities do we have in terms of natural resources? And, it seems as though we haven't really achieved much in this sector. Considering that we have opportunities available, what challenges do you think that we have faced so far that hasn't allowed us to maximize and utilize the natural resources we have, especially in the energy sector?
I think that's a really good question, and it's something that Nigeria should really reflect on. Nigeria has huge gas reserves. We have about 200 trillion cubic feet of gas, which for Nigeria portends all the different uses that we could leverage that gas for. There are non-gas uses, non-power uses, and then there are power uses. So power in terms of lighting up this room that we're in right now, non-power uses for transportation, for cooking, and other industrial uses as well. So Nigeria sees this potential and wants to leverage gas for these uses. The government has put in place a very expansive gas utilization program, which tells of its ambitions for gas. The challenges there are that this is not a new story. We've heard this over many, many years, but there have been challenges. There have been slow uptake. There's a lot of infrastructure that you require to get gas from the source to end users. Infrastructure like pipelines and power stations and all of these different infrastructure. But Nigeria has not invested in them over the years. Now we have a huge infrastructure deficit, which will require about $20 billion every year to be able to catch up. But you have a country that's also struggling with a lot of fiscal challenges, with inflation, with debts, a lot of different issues, right? Within that context, you're going to need foreign funds. But where we can access this sort of capital, those countries and institutions have committed to defund fossil fuel projects. This commitment was made at the last COP. So with this context, it means that Nigeria has to be more realistic and practical in the sort of decisions that it makes. In 2007, Nigeria had this really huge plan that it designed, which was then launched in 2008, which is the Gas Master Plan. In 2016, Nigeria had the National Gas Policy, which recognized that the ambition that it had initially may not necessarily be available in terms of getting access to the foreign markets. However, that there were still opportunities. Now, fast forward to 2021, when Nigeria then put out the Decade of Gas Initiative, which means that from 2021 to 2030, the government intends to leverage its gas for domestic uses, for exports, etc. But it brings back into force all of those grand ambitions that we had with the Gas Master Plan. And the context I've set, the context has changed, right? So we cannot have the same sort of ambitions that we had in the past. Now there are opportunities for renewables, right? So it makes sense for Nigeria to identify how we can transition using gas, but not betting too heavily into gas, getting investments for renewables where those exist. To be fair to Nigeria, there are already investments by the African Development Bank and World Bank trying to upscale renewables, but there's a lot more that can be done. There are signals that Nigeria can also send to the international public to say, yes, we're trying to leverage what we have in terms of gas. We recognize our limitations, but we also are available to invest in renewables. And these are the clear ambitions that we have that to integrate both gas and renewables. Nigeria, unfortunately, only just published Decade of Gas ambitions in May this year. That's 4 years into the plan. So there's a lot that still needs to be done to integrate that with the existing energy transition plan and other plans that we have so that we're actually all working in tandem to ensure that we achieve the sustainable energy future.
Okay. So now you spoke about the Decade of Gas initiative, and recently they signed the GSPA between for the brass methanol project. So do you think that in any way this would help reduce our dependence on oil? Since we're trying to see how we can delve more, we're moving away from that oil sector into renewables and a more cleaner and alternative source of energy. So do you think that with this initiative, what do you think they really need to improve on to ensure that we reduce our dependence on oil and boost our exports in terms of gas and renewables in the global market?
Okay, that's a really good question, and I'll start that by laying a bit of foundation, right? Nigeria, like I said, is betting big on gas. We're looking at a cleaner energy future, but what does that mean? The world is moving away from fossil fuels to cleaner energy sources. Gas is a fossil fuel, right? So even though we're moving away from oil, the trajectory is also to move away from gas, right? Or determine what that would look like, because Nigeria has said that it will achieve net zero by 2060, leveraging gas as that transition fuel, right? That also means reducing our emissions in the atmosphere, right? Which contributes to climate change, which contributes to environmental pollution, which contributes to health impacts of those that live around those installations, right? So you have cardiovascular and respiratory issues that humans are facing that live in those regions. So it's important for us to strike that very important balance, right? In addition to what you have shared, there is also the gas commercialization program, gas commercialization program that Nigeria has also launched, which started in 2016, but the government has now ramped it up. What that program is doing is trying to ensure that Nigeria is able to use its gas for power, as I said, and non-power uses. But we're also reducing the gas flaring, which Nigeria is 8th around the world right now, right? And another thing as well that contributes to Nigeria being able to assess those global markets is to reduce its methane emissions, right? Which is contributed to by gas flaring, fugitives, and venting. To be able to access markets like the EU, where Nigeria exports 40% of its crude oil exports, and exports 60% of its LNG, Nigeria is going to have to reduce emissions as it's expanding this gas uses for now as transition fuel. Because in 2027, there's an EU regulation that will be coming into force that will restrict high emitting countries that want to export their products to have access to the EU market. And it goes, to reason that we'll likely have other markets also replicating similar regulations, because all of these countries have committed to reducing emissions, in the fight to avert climate change. So it's important that, yes, Nigeria is doing something, which is important to see, but we have to also ensure that we advocate for those programs as gas commercialization programs to be ramped up, that while Nigeria wants to, yes, address its developmental needs, it also has to bear in mind its national and global commitments to reduce environmental hazards that affect the human beings on the ground, who we also have to remember and put at the center of these policies that we're putting in place, because it's about people first.
I was just going there to the topic of methane emissions that come from gas. Of course, it has a lot of environmental impact. How do you think we can balance the need to develop our gas infrastructure, with being able to ensure that it does not contribute to negatively affecting climate change? Do you think there's a way we can balance this out to ensure that while we're pushing for infrastructure development in this sector, we are still able to protect the environment and, like you said, the people that are in the environment?
There are technologies that can be put in place to manage our emissions. First of all, you have to be able to measure before you can mitigate.
Yeah.
Right? So the government has put in place a guideline that provides sort of steps that companies can take to reduce their methane emissions. But compliance and implementation is very important. Ensuring that, as Nigeria policy, we have a lot of policies, we have a lot of regulations and laws and guidelines and such, but it's important for us to make sure that those are implementable.
Yeah.
And working in tandem with the companies is important. But that's also the upstream. We also need the midstream and the downstream also taken care of, right? We have been talking about the Dangote refinery so much recently, but without similar regulations or guidelines to inform that space, there's also a risk. So I would also obviously encourage the NMDPRA, which is the downstream and midstream regulator, to also come up with similar sort of guidelines as well to help Nigeria mitigate. And then technologies too. NRGI, for our part, we've done a lot of work in improving the understanding of civil society and the media on how methane emissions works, how to mitigate it. And in fact, we collaborated with the NATI, that's the Nigerian Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, to develop a template that they were able to use to collect data on emissions from companies. 15 companies actually adhered to this, including Exxon. 47 did not. So there's still a long way to go, because again, you need to understand what's going on first, data, to be able to make any progress, right? So you have organizations in the world that are trying to leverage satellites to be able to track the emissions that come with companies. So there are technologies that can be adopted to try to reduce this. There are regulations and laws that need to be put in place by the regulators. But everyone working in tandem, I'm sure will ensure that that balance can be struck between, as Nigeria is trying to leverage, its gas, that it's still keeping in mind both its national and global commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, specifically methane for the oil and gas sector.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's look at energy access. I think one of the major challenges we face in Nigeria and even Africa as a whole is energy poverty, and especially there's a significant divide in energy access between the rural and the urban areas. You'll be surprised that even in 2024, there's still some places in Nigeria, let's even bring it down to Nigeria, that they've never seen electricity, they've never seen light. What do you think we can do differently, or in what ways can renewables and gas contribute to bridging this gap of energy access between the remote and the urban areas, while still pushing for a sustainable use of these sources? How can in what ways can this sector, both renewables and gas, is there a way they can contribute to ensure that while we're pushing for this development, while we're pushing for this smooth transition, it's not just limited to we that are here in the urban areas, it's also reach those people that are in those remote areas? What systems can we put in place to ensure that this is able to bridge the gap of energy access between urban and rural areas?
Another good question. I think one of the issues with that, or ways to ensure that those rural areas have access to energy, is affordability, and certain policies that we need to put in place to make it accessible as well. A lot is actually being done by the government. There's the Rural Electrification Agency, REA, that's doing a lot to try to get these energy options to those on the ground. And they're obviously providing incentives and grants to companies that are able to install these energy sources on the ground. They're focusing on rural areas, as the name denotes, and creating incentives and creating sort of cooperatives and these sorts of different instruments that make it easier for those living in rural areas to be able to access these sorts of energy sources. I think scaling it up is obviously something that's going to be very important, because right now there is some progress being made with a lot of the funding coming from the African Development Bank and World Bank, but a lot more funding is required. I will say, to be able to access those sort of funds, the government needs to put in place policy incentives that can attract that sort of investments. The more philanthropic investment that is concerned about energy access, working with the UN programs that have sustainable development in mind, So I think that's what the government needs to do, and then also ensure that as it's getting these sort of resources, it's getting to the rural areas, right? Those who don't have access to power. Another really good innovation that the government has put in place has also been liberalizing the power sector, where subnational governments now have the ability to, develop transmission, distribution of energy by themselves. So working with the subnational governments as well, that's the federal government who has a lot more experience in this sort of space, making sure that subnational governments have the right information and the right sort of investments, put in place the right sort of policies as well that will attract that funding that's required. Even though renewables is a really great opportunity, you find that in Africa, we're still getting access to very limited renewable funding. Africa only has about 4% of the funding that's going around the world, which is quite limited. So a lot still needs to be done to break into that market. Because, as you said, we are the ones that require energy because we still have the least energy access around the world. So these are things that I think are important to ensure that those that are in rural area have access to energy as well.
Okay. All right. We're taking a short break now, and when we come back, we'll delve more into the conversation. Please stay with us. Thank you for staying with us. Welcome back. So, Tengi, let's continue. You spoke about liberalizing the sector. Some people are of the opinion, some experts would say that one of the best ways we can improve our energy sector, both the renewable and the gas, is by privatizing it. Do you think that more investments would come in, we'll see more development in our energy sector if it is fully privatized?
I think when you say energy sector, that's quite broad.
For gas, renewables.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
There are aspects of it that are private. So in the rural electrification project, for instance, they're getting private sector to actually work to install, solar and all of these different energy options. It's a mixed, space. If you look at the oil and gas that we have as well, if you look at LNG as an example, you have different IOCs that are on the managing sort of framework of that institution. So it's a mix in the space. It's about what works, right? I think when people refer to this, they probably refer a lot of that to the refineries that have not worked for a number of years, right? In a proper way. We've only had about 13% utilization of our refineries for numbers of years. People are optimistic that with the Dangote privatized refinery, that we'll see a lot more effective management. I will say that we should try to change things if it doesn't work and put in my policy to try and make it work. And I think this government has been doing a lot of that actually, is testing and putting different things in place because things are not static and you cannot see the future, So if something doesn't work, you try a different approach and not continue the same way that you have for so long. And that imperative is even more urgent given climate change and given the policies that are being made by our trade partners and what we require to be able to access these sorts of funds that we need to continue to develop Nigeria.
Okay, so what do you think the government needs to do differently to create an enabling environment for these private sectors and as well to ensure that because we really need to reduce the dependence that we have on oil, especially. So what do you think they can do differently to create an enabling environment to be able to push more for these renewables and also to improve the infrastructures and the technologies that need to be improved for us to get to that space where we want to get to?
That is a intriguing question. When we speak about oil often, and then we speak about gas and renewables, there are different sort of facets and how they sort of complement each other, etc. I want to stick to oil and gas for a little bit because I'm recognizing that there might be a bit of context I need to set. So obviously we have our oil and we have our gas, but we also have associated gas, gas that is associated with oil production, right? So it's not as one-to-one, it's not as separate. Oil and gas is not as separate, that business, right? So as we're phasing out our oil, we're necessarily kind of phasing out our gas in that associated gas sort of, because we have not built enough around our non-associated gas, and there are complexities there. I just wanted to lay that foundation for those who might be listening, because it can be a little confusing. And then going back to your question, there's a lot that the government can do. I've mentioned some of it already, but I think as well, we also need to make sure that we are not simply takers, but also owners. What do I mean by that? We've seen the oil and gas story, right? Where Nigeria has to import a lot of its refined crude products. We now have the renewable story, where we don't have a lot of the technology and a lot of the equipment that we need developed at home. We have to import a lot of these sort of products. So creating an ecosystem, a renewables value chain, incentivizing that sector to grow is, I think, a good first step for the government. We have a lot of young people with a lot of skills. So I think providing opportunities for the youth to innovate and come up with ideas that can really start to build homegrown solutions. I was at an international conference recently, and I was very intrigued by something that I learned there, where in Senegal, a number of years ago, it was almost like it was a history lesson. So in Senegal, a number of years ago, they had issues with fossil fuels. And so they leveraged peanut oil to run their ships as well, to move products from one place to the other. I was really intrigued by that. That is something that has been lost to history. Those are options that, we're always eating granules, right? So that is, I was blown by that idea. And I'm like, when can we start thinking about innovative solutions that are homegrown, that are available to us, right? So I think it requires us to also bring in our universities, right? Where we likely have all of this information that we're not leveraging, So there's a lot that we can do, both conventional and unconventional. And it's important for the government to recognize that everybody has a role to play, and benefits and value that we can bring to this conversation, and look at our lost files, for instance, homegrown solutions, but also with what exists. Let's start to create an enabling environment, incentives, tax breaks in those areas, right, where we can really grow that sector. And maybe at some point we actually become a space where other African countries can start to import, if we have solar, batteries and all of these things as well. We have the solid mineral sector, which we have left, ignored for years because we had the oil and gas. So how do we leverage the minerals that we actually have as well? We have lithium, we have all of these different metals and minerals that can be, used with the renewable sector. Like maybe we cannot build our own cars yet, but we can provide, minerals that can contribute to that, and make deals where we can maybe trade and say, we'll give you a bit of minerals and give us like cars. Who knows what that could be? There are so many different innovations that we can put in place that can make sure that we start to, build out our solid mineral sector, and then also leverage that into our renewable sector as well. There are so many opportunities. And the time is now, because the world is moving ahead so fast. You hear about the DRC and all the different other countries regionally. Africa even has access to most of the metals and minerals that you need. So when you look at that space, you see that Africa contributes a lot to that. When you look at the processing phase, China has cornered that market. So it's important for the rest of the world, Nigeria especially, because that's where we're from, to really pay attention, right, and really key into that sector. It's really important.
Okay. So finally, what are the next steps for us as a country? How close do you think we are towards achieving a smooth transition to these alternative energy sources? What are the next steps for us in the future phase? How much do you think that how soon do you think we can achieve all these things?
I mean, Nigeria has designed a plan, the Energy Transition Plan, as well as the NDCs, so the nationally determined contributions. And I think that is due to be updated in next year, February, right? We have the long-term vision, 2050. We have a number of plans. So it's important for us to, one, make sure the plans are practical.
Yes.
Make sure that they're updated, because a lot is going on, but Nigerian public not aware of it. I mentioned earlier on that the Executive Gas Plan for 2021 came out in May 2024, right? So it's making sure that there's clarity in terms of where we're going and what role everyone has to play, what role every government ministry has to play. No one operating in silos, because right now you have people operating in silos, not knowing what's happening in the gas sector, what happened in the gas sector, happened in the renewable sector. We need to make that interface, right? So that we know where gas stops and where renewables begins, for the timeline, and where they meet, where they overlap, right? We need a bit more clarity on where what role everyone is supposed to play, what private sector is supposed to do, where the funding is going to come from, how much funding has been made, and how it has been deployed, where the gaps are, what private sector can do, what the opportunities are, and then creating incentives as well, for those sectors. And bringing along civil society and the media as well, because Nigerians need to know what's going on. Exactly. Because also you require behavioral change. You require the woman who is used to cooking jollof rice with charcoal to now switch to some other method, right? You require the person who is driving a fueled car to switch to CNG in the interim. Even though I have an issue with switching to CNG and then electric, I remember the case might be, who has the money for all of that, right? But in any case, bringing everyone along, being very clear, so that we can also interrogate those plans and say, this is your CNG to electric, does not make sense. Maybe it doesn't make sense. Maybe you need to do it in a different way. But we need to know what the plans are. Yes. We need to know how they're integrated first before we can now interrogate it, right? But everybody has to be brought along. So that's a very important step. NRGI actually produced, me and I co-authored with someone, the guidebook on Nigeria's energy transition. I think that's something that people can leverage to know a bit more, because there's only so much I can say in this short bit of time. So those I think some first key steps: clarity, plans around implementation, milestones, what the targets are, so we can track, as you said, how we're getting along this process. I can only say based on what is available, and we don't have clarity. That's just the honest truth. The government is doing a lot of work, but we need to carry Nigerians along in that process.
Thank you so much, Tengi, for joining us on the program. It's good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Tengi Georgie Kohli is a senior officer and lead of the Natural Resource Governance Institute's Nigeria program and Publish What You Pay Global Council member. NRGI's program rethinks oil's resources and oil's roles in Nigeria's economy in light of the petroleum sector's declining performance and the uncertainties caused by global shifts to cleaner energy. As part of the program, Tengi provides technical and capacity-building expertise for government and civil society and develops products to reduce the knowledge gap and understanding on Nigeria's energy transition plan. And that brings us to the end of the program today on Policy on the Go. It's clear that while renewables are the future of natural resources, natural gas can play a pivotal role in Africa's energy transition if used sustainably. A strategic approach that embraces both innovation and policy reforms and environmental responsibility will be key. The road ahead requires partnership between government and private sectors, as well as communities, to ensure that not only do we supervise but also contribute to energy needs and contribute to a more sustainable future. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Tony Ogubanjo. Till next time, do take care of yourself.